Welcome to those of you who are joining. We're going to get started in just a minute here. It is 12:30 right now. I'm Jennifer Thompson. I'm the Executive Director of Civil Squared, and you hopefully can also see Russ, and we will get started in just a minute here as we let people enter the webinar. Russ, you are in DC, in the DC area right now?
I am in the Maryland suburbs outside of our nation's capital.
Are you experiencing any hurricane related?
It's raining like crazy here, and the civility of the conversation is at a very low level. So I'm doing my best to insulate myself from the weather of all kinds.
Very good. Very good. Excellent. Okay. Well, let's go ahead and get started because we want to be respectful of your time. And we are very glad that those of you who are joining us have taken the time out of your day because we have a really great conversation for you today. We're going to be talking with Russ, obviously Russ, the host of EconTalk. And we want to thank Russ for joining us along with our friends at the Library of Economics and Liberty who are co-hosting this event with us. We're going to tell you a little bit more about the Library of Economics and Liberty later on in case you are not already familiar with the great work that they do. So the plan is Russ and I are going to talk for a little while, somewhere in the range of 30 to 35 minutes or so. And then we want to give all of you in the audience a chance to ask some questions as well. So we've got a lot of people joining us. There's a Q&A function that you can use to send us questions, and you don't need to wait until later in this conversation to send us the questions. Please feel free to send the questions throughout. My colleagues are going to be batching the questions. And again, since we do have a number of people joining us, make sure that you get those in, because if you submit it about 2 minutes before the end of the webinar, we're not going to get to it. We will do our best to get to as many as we can. So please be sure to put those in the Q&A. If you know Russ, but you don't know Civil Squared, I definitely want to tell you a little bit about what we do at Civil Squared. Our purpose is to get unlike-minded people talking to one another, because that's how together we think we can create the most effective solutions to the challenges that we face in our communities. And we believe that the problems we're dealing with in our country are not going to be solved by silencing disagreement. So we think civil discourse is essential to building and maintaining a free and prosperous society. So we're about the exchange, the free exchange of ideas, not just goods and services. And so we create spaces for civil conversations among independent thinkers. And we do that through live events like this one. We have a weekly email newsletter, twice monthly podcast, and we post content, curate content, create content over at our website at civilsquared.org. So we wanted to get together with you and with Russ today because a few weeks ago, my colleagues and I, after watching the first presidential debate, realized we were pretty discouraged about what we had been seeing in sort of rhetoric. And discouraged is not a great place to start from if you want to make things better. So our thought was kind of that if you want to learn about what makes a good conversation and how to have them with people who disagree, there's someone out there who has an awful lot of experience who does just that on a weekly basis. So welcome, Russ.
Great to be with you.
I suspect most people on here know Russ, but I'm going to give you a little bit of background. He is the John and Jean Nault Research Fellow at Stanford University's Hoover Institution. And what is so cool about Russ is all the fantastic work he's done to make economics accessible to everyone. He's got books with awesome titles like How Adam Smith Can Change Your Life, or The Invisible Heart, an economic romance. He's got videos like the rap battles between famous economists, poems. We sent some of that out with some of the confirmation emails, and all kinds of different creative outlets. He's a teacher, 3-time Teacher of the Year, and he's currently teaching at George Mason University. But of course, most of you know Russ probably as the host of EconTalk, where, how many episodes now, Russ? Over 725?
760 actually, plus.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
He talks to all kinds of people, and his guests have a wide variety of expertise and knowledge and viewpoints. So Russ, would you describe yourself as someone who knows how to have a productive conversation? Is that the kind of thing you think about yourself?
Well, I think about that all the time when I'm hosting EconTalk. And I have to say, for better or for worse, I'm not teaching at George Mason these days, although I enjoyed it very much. I'm full-time at the Hoover Institution.
Okay.
No problem. if you go back and listen to EconTalk when we started in 2006 or 2007, and compare it to today, I think you'll notice two things. One, in the early days, I only interviewed economists, and now they're just a part of who I talk to. I try to talk to people who can teach me something, and there's still some economists who can teach me something, I hope, and that you can learn from as a listener. So I do still talk to them, but I'm interested in philosophy, history, psychology, education policy, health policy, and so on. So that's one obvious difference. But the second difference is I've changed my style. And part of that is just getting better at doing something when you've done it 760 times. But a lot of it was, a reflection on what I wanted the show to be. And in particular, I'm always eager to invite people onto the program that I don't agree with ideologically, and strive, or policy-wise, and strive to have a civil conversation and to give them the floor whenever I can. And having said that, I'll add, it's really hard to do.
Yeah.
As a former faculty member and professor, most people go into academic life because they like to hear themselves talk. And they like to lecture by definition. That's listen to yourself talk. And so what's been exhilarating for me actually is both learning how to be a little more patient and a little less strident when interviewing people. And if you ever see me speak publicly in an event, which is the equivalent, giving a lecture, a lot of people will say to me, well, what happened to the guy who's the host of EconTalk? You're so excited. And my job on EconTalk is to be less excited intellectually, but less excited about my own particular acts that I might want to grind, and to make sure that the person I'm interviewing has a chance to share their ideas. Now, I challenge them, as often if I don't agree with them, but I try to do it politely and try to do it civilly and try to do it in a way that's educational, not to score points, not to win, but to help us all learn something. And, one of my favorite unfortunate comments I'll get sometimes is, how could you let that person get away with saying such and such? And the answer is, well, I thought I could learn something from them. At that particular point, I didn't learn so much, but there were other moments where I did. And that's the nature of conversation.
So I want to go back. Actually, you mentioned listening to the early episodes of EconTalk. And I want to go back to the beginning and ask, you mentioned that as a professor, you get used to the sort of lecture format. But I take it when you started EconTalk, you did that intentionally with conversation in mind, right? You said you were talking to mostly economists, and now you're talking to different people. But I imagine there would have been people who would have been interested in a podcast of you lecturing. Why conversation? Why was that the approach you took?
So that's a great question. And it brings something I think that we should talk about that I think is powerful. And I don't have any evidence for it. It's just a pet theory of mine, which is that the human brain is designed to listen and learn via conversation rather than monologue. You learn something from a monologue, you learn something from a lecture, but something different is happening when you exchange ideas. One of the things I tell my guests in the last few years is, I always say, this works best as a conversation, meaning it's not, I ask a question, you answer it, then I ask the next question, you answer it, and vice versa. My ideal, which doesn't always happen, but my ideal is that the guest and I create something unique. It's not just a list of things that in their book that are interesting. It's the product of our back and forth, and something novel comes out of that. And I like to think that for listeners, one of the things listeners sometimes say is, you ask the same questions that I wanted to ask. So that's one way to think about my job. I'm there to ask the question you as the listener would ask. So I'm simulating in a certain way the opportunity for the listener to engage in conversation with the guest. And at the same time, I think that works best. So I think allows the listener and myself to process that information. So it's an art. It's hard to do via Zoom because you can't interject effectively. You have to kind of wait till the other person has stopped speaking. In general, that's a good idea. It's a good idea not to be so eager to get your words in that you interrupt. But in actual human conversation, I think interruption is very common. And we interject lots of things besides our correct opinion relative to our person we're talking to. So I'll, like, you just smiled at me. You might chuckle appreciatively.
Mhm.
That's your way of saying to me, oh, that was funny and I knew it. So keep going. Sometimes you say, there's, meaning I'm listening. So all those things get a little bit lost over Zoom, but we do the best we can to simulate that.
Well, and in fact, I was thinking today, it's nice to be on Zoom because you don't have to have a mask on, and not having facial expressions when you're talking to people makes it really hard to get all those cues. So we were talking about conversation, and we, on a recent episode of our podcast, had Tanya Israel, who is a professor of psychology. I learned the most, I think, from psychologists about this at UC Santa Barbara, and she's got a book called Beyond Your Bubble about conversations across a political divide. And when I first read her book, I thought to myself, I mean, how can I need a step-by-step thing on conversation? But then at the end of it, I thought most of what I do isn't really dialogue or conversation, because if you're gonna, the way she describes it, if you're gonna do it, first she talks about conversation as an opportunity, not a mandate, right? You don't have to engage in every, conversation that presents itself to you. But also, she talks about the importance of getting ready for it, and not just knowing what you want to accomplish, that's important, but also being ready to control your own kind of physical reactions and everything else, particularly at times when you're talking to people who you really disagree with, because, being attentive to the fact that your blood pressure might be going up, if they're saying something you disagree with. And when I looked at all those things, I thought, man, if you're really going to have a productive dialogue, you have to do some work. So what kind of stuff are you doing as you're thinking about the conversations you're having with these people? And in part, I guess I'm asking too, how do you decide who you're going to talk to? Because I suspect all kinds of people present themselves as being interested in talking to you on the podcast. How do you pick who you're going to talk to? And once you have, what do you do to get prepared for that conversation?
So I'm going to forget the second part of your question.
That's okay. I'll get it back to you.
So you'll remind me about how I pick my guests, and maybe I'll remember. But I wanted to respond to the first part, which is a question of preparation. Because I think I actually disagree with the way you worded that. It may be actually what Tanya Israel is talking about, and you represented her fairly, but maybe you've altered it. So I don't want to be critical of of her, but I'll just be critical of you, Jennifer.
That's fine. That's fine.
What you put on the table, which is that it's a very subtle thing. You said, it's not just what you want to get out of the conversation. And I think a lot of times we have a purposeful aspect to conversation. Let's say I'm negotiating a deal.
Mm-hmm.
I want to get, there's certain things I want to make sure I get in the final negotiation. Or I might want to get your okay to do something. So I'm going to maybe set you up with some kind thoughts to begin with, and then I'll do my ask. And that's my goals. Like I've got to get her agreement. So a lot of conversations are like that. And there's outside the business context, there's I've got to tell them that story. I hope I get to tell that story. Or, I just read this good book. I'm going to tell this person I'm having lunch with all about this good book. So I have those urges all the time. I have a goal for the conversation.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to suggest, and then I will tie it into EconTalk and just political conversation. I want to suggest that it's not always good to have a goal.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's sort of natural that we say, I got to make sure I get the most out of this half an hour I have with so-and-so. But a lot of times, and in my experience, the best conversations come when I don't have a goal.
Yeah.
I'm going to go into this conversation, or even the other extreme, I'm going to see what this person needs from me, and I'm going to give them that. And sometimes it's just attention. I'm just going to listen. Sometimes they need my thoughts on some question they're struggling with. And, if I'm really eager to get my 2 cents in, my turn, my alternative rant, I may miss that chance to connect with the person I'm talking to. And that's a real lost opportunity. So
yeah,
I just want to put your mind, I was teasing about, you're being wrong or anything. It's not that. It's just sometimes in a human context, having a goal is actually a mistake.
Yeah.
You don't want to have a goal. You want to say, I am open to what this half an hour, hour, lunch or coffee encounter or Zoom call. I'm going to see what comes of it. And I'm going to view it like I would, you can think about travel this way. You can think about and I was talking to an EconTalk guest that's coming up soon about this. You can see yourself as a consumer, as a tourist, or an appreciator. And that's a certain headset, a certain mindset place to put your head. Like, so I'm going to this conversation as a consumer. What am I getting out of it? But maybe sometimes you should just go in as an appreciator. It's like, I'm just going to enjoy this. We'll see where it goes. Some people, when they go on vacation, they map out their itinerary to the half an hour. We're going to this museum at 10 o'clock. We'll stay there for an hour and a half. Then we'll have lunch at the da-da-da. Then we'll see that fresco over there. And we'll have all this plan. And that's personality disorder, which I suffer from myself sometimes. It's the nature of our personality, our demeanor, our temperament. Other people go, I'm going to walk around this city and who knows what I'll see? Who knows what I'll find? Of course, if you're not careful, you miss the Mona Lisa. Yeah. Which is overrated in my view. I haven't seen it, but I think that's too many people spend their trip to Paris worrying about when they're going to see the Mona Lisa. Boy.
And they got a list of things they have to check off.
That's a mistake. Yeah. That's another way to say it. In this conversation, what's on my to-do list for this conversation? And I'm going to prep beforehand. I'm going to figure out what I'm going to get out of it. Just put it in my notebook or on my, in my app on my phone or my computer. And then I'll see how I did and I'll get better. Yeah. And I think a lot of times the right attitude is I'm going to see what happens. So to bring it to EconTalk.
Yeah, but before you do that, if I can, just real quickly, that's all very fair. And as a philosopher personally, I feel like that's the right way. Like those dinner conversations you have where you've sat for hours talking to people and you didn't plan to start out or plan to get to a particular point are often the most productive. To her credit, to credit her and not my mistake of what she's doing, but I think this is important actually. She's talking specifically about political conversations about political issues. And it actually lines up with what you're saying. When she's talking about being intentional, she wants to make sure that people don't go in with too many expectations, right? To say, well, I'm going to go talk to this person about who disagrees with me, and I'm going to persuade them of my opinion. First, she says, you've got to not overestimate your own ability to persuade people, right?
Yeah, great idea.
But that productive conversation does so many things, all of which you just talked about a little bit. It helps you understand people. It helps you appreciate different points of view. It helps you refine your own point of view.
Yeah.
And it can be healing, right? I mean, it can actually heal relationships if you're doing it. And none of that has to do with persuasion. So I definitely want to get back to that, particularly in your most recent episode of EconTalk, which I thought was a fabulous kind of modeling of people who disagree talking about stuff. But now I want to go back and let you answer the other part of the question about how you're getting prepared.
So you asked me two other parts, which was how do I pick my guests and how do I get prepared? And the simple answer of how I pick my guests is I pick guests whose book I want to read or whose brain I want to pick. There's really nothing else to it. If I don't want to read their book, I don't want to talk to them, even if they're really interesting. It's just, I like to read the book beforehand. And, so that's pretty simple. And I've made some mistakes. I've invited guests. Turns out I don't want to read their book or they're not very articulate, which is a separate problem, but most of them are fabulous. It's an incredible gift. I thank Liberty Fund that sponsors EconTalk for this opportunity. It's kept me intellectually vibrant in a way I would never, ever have imagined. I've learned more from EconTalk probably than many of my listeners, which is glorious. And so I pick my guests, basically the simple one-line version is people I want to learn from, people who have something to teach me, help me understand something better. In terms of prep, I read the book beforehand, I write the questions. What I'm trying to do in the questions is create a narrative arc that I think will allow the listener to absorb the information that I think is worth understanding from the book. So, I go off that script. I don't just read down the list of questions. I try to make it more spontaneous. And in recent years, I've tried harder at that to be open to where the conversation might go. Doesn't always work, by the way. I'm talking about this beauty of spontaneity. Sometimes you go down a rabbit hole. It's like, oh, why did we go over there? That was a mistake. Should have stuck to the script. So it's imperfect. It's not science, obviously. But the other thing I'll do is...
This makes me wonder, though, in those conversations, because I've listened to a lot of your conversations, are you doing a lot of editing on them? Or is it, okay.
Almost none. I tell the guest board, I said, this is our, it's our conversation. That's what we're going to put up. Occasionally I take out I lose my train of thought. We do go down a rabbit hole, and I know people are going to just be confused. It's not it's it's uninteresting, but I don't generally edit for uninteresting. It's not the idea, and I hope it's mostly all of it's mostly interesting, or it wouldn't be worth having on the show. And the other thing in prep I want to mention is that I'm going to say this. I'm not sure it's true, but when I have a guest on who I know I'm going to disagree with, sometimes I prep myself to try to be calm.
Mm-hmm.
People, again, listeners will say to me, "Why? How could you let him get away with that?" And I want to say, "Yeah, it wasn't easy. Just how could you stay calm when the guest claimed?" And sometimes it's hard. And I mentioned earlier that I have a different demeanor when I give a public presentation. So once people ask me, "Well, why are you so different on EconTalk?" And the answer is, I put my EconTalk hat on. I actually have a literal EconTalk hat now. You can go to my website, russroberts.info, and we have merchandise of hats, and you can even get an EconTalk pillow or bath towel. Oh, the excitement. But I'm really, of course, talking about a figurative hat that I know I'm there to keep my cool. Now, there many times I've come close to losing it, and you can hear it. There are a couple of historic episodes where, I got pushed to the limit. Somebody was I think disrespectful, say, which happens.
Mm-hmm.
And I had to try to stay calm. And I think that's, my joke about that is, EconTalk in those situations builds character. It's made me a better person. And I love that. I love being calm. So when you talk about preparing for a political conversation or a conversation, you're going to disagree with people, I think it does require, I was teasing about prepping, but you should prep yourself for staying calm. And that's not easy. It's an art, takes a lot of practice. And again, I think the other strategy there that's important in those settings is not to alternate rants, not to have, okay, that person ranted at me, so I'll show them, I'll rant twice as effectively. I'll prove they're wrong. I actually, in those settings, I have one thing I want them to learn, one piece of information that I think might get them to imagine a different world. I'll give you an example. I was once talking to a journalist who was talking about how much he hated Walmart. He said, Walmart, they're horrible. They put the mom and pop stores out of business. And I don't remember what I said to him. I remember it kind of made my blood boil. I'm not a fan of Walmart, but I don't like that sort of, that they're somehow oppressing people. So I said the wrong thing in real time. What I should have said in response was, how did they do that? Just a calm, rhetorical question. Give him the chance to teach me something I don't know, or for him to reflect on, because the answer to that is, they didn't go around with baseball bats breaking the windows of the mom and pop stores. They put better merchandise in their stores at better prices. And we, the customers, put the mom and pops out of business because we stopped shopping there. Yeah. So when you have that perspective, different. It's like, oh, that's the goal of that one comment. If I could make that calm, and if I yelled at him or showed him that I was angry, education's dead. His back goes up. He starts getting angry. There's no learning. All it is a shouting match of who can be louder, more prove that they're more passionate about their position. I used to be that way when I was younger. I still am sometimes. Try not to be now.
You did say that when we were talking before this. You said something, because I made a note of it, that anger is an obstacle to learning, right? Yeah. If you're so focused on your own emotion about that. Another person we had on, Pamela Paresky, who's another psychologist who worked with Jonathan Haidt, who was one of your former guests, and Greg Lukianoff on the coddling of the American mind. One of the things she says is you shouldn't go into these kind of conversations, the political ones, thinking again about persuasion, and you don't even need to go in thinking about agreement. Really, what you should bring with you is curiosity, intellectual curiosity, right? So you look at someone else and you say, this person is totally opposed to me on this point, right? Whether it's a policy position or whatever else it is. But in every other respect, this person's a lot like me, right? They seem like an intelligent person. They seem like a person who cares about the people in their lives, who cares about their community, that they're dedicated to that. And so I ought to be able to really gin up enough intellectual curiosity to say, how did they come to that point of view, right? And this, to me, when you describe, EconTalk as conversations for the curious. I think just thinking back to this recent episode you had with Frederick de Boer, I think,
Yeah.
Who is the episode notes listed as a self-described Marxist, and
Yep.
you are, shall we say, not.
Not.
I'm going to take a little detour into one of my favorite subjects, complaining about Facebook. We recently had Stephanie Slate, who's the managing editor of Reason, on, and we posted on Facebook her New York Times op-ed, and it is the title is something like "Republicans are ripping out the very heart and soul of their party." And that's a quote. She's quoting Reagan there, right? Reagan said libertarianism is the heart and soul of conservatism. Well, we posted this on Facebook, and like within 3 seconds, we had people who said, look, I can't believe you're putting something out from the New York Times. It's a leftist propaganda rag. I'm not going to read that. Or you call yourself a centrist organization, which we don't. And therefore, and you put this kind of trash up. I think a lot of conversations we have or try to have are like that, right? Saying, well, I totally disagree with this person. So you've got this guy who's a self-described Marxist, and he's on to talk about his book, which is about education and about the way systems of education are. But throughout that conversation, as you're talking about the book, you get to a point where you're actually talking about his point of view and asking him to put it out there so that you can respond to it. But all of that is done. Nobody's raising their voice. And I think that requires a lot of trust on both people's part. So just in that instance, that conversation itself, how did you think about that?
Well, I read his book, and his book is I disagree with large chunks of it. Most of it's not about his Marxist view. It's his view of education, which is quite provocative, which is that we can't reform the education system. There's a certain inevitability about differences between us, intellectual differences, and to pretend that everybody can get across some particular intellectual finish line is a fantasy. That's his main thing. And it's an interesting idea. I don't totally agree with it as a teacher and as being married to a teacher. And we've spent a lot of time talking about education and what people can grasp and how you can get people to stretch and reach for higher goals if you expect a lot of them. My wife's a high school teacher, where I think that's very important. So, that's really interesting. So that part was easy to talk about. The Marxist part, I thought was less, it wasn't as fleshed out in the book. So when we talked about that, I didn't think we were going to have a shouting match. And I also had a inkling from his book of what kind of person he is. And, I'll give you two different kind of experiences. There are some people who write horrible things in their books, ridiculous, absurd claims, positions. And when I challenge them on the show, they actually they say things like, yeah, well, that was just in the book. I know. I thought kind of thinking, what?
Really?
Why would you put that? Why would you exaggerate? I don't think there's one way to think about it. It was just, it's just in the moment, he thought he'd deflect my criticism, but it felt like he actually meant that. He actually meant that he'd, kind of exaggerated it for effect. It's like when you have a press release about some study, the authors don't necessarily write the press release. The PR office, say for the university, writes the press release, and they tend to put it in sort of grandiose terms. And if you press the people who did the actual study, they say, oh yeah, it was kind of embarrassing that, the PR people left out all the caveats and the maybes and the fact that it could be as much as or as little as. And so when somebody does that in a book, an author, an academic, it kind of just shocks me. The other thing, though, which I think is important, and comes back to your earlier point, there are people who've asked, not people, I have listeners who say, why don't you interview so-and-so? And so-and-so is somebody who disagrees with me to the same level, say, as this week's guest, Frederick de Boer. And, I don't write this back to them because I don't want to say this about another person, but the reason I don't invite so-and-so is that I don't respect so-and-so. I've read their arguments. I find them cherry-picked and mean-spirited and disrespectful and caricatures of my view. Right? They disagree with my view, but it's a caricature of my view. Why do I want to have a discussion with them where I'm going to try to convince them, again, a convincing, not an educational dialogue, that, oh, actually, I'm a nicer person than you think. I have a lot of people who, on Twitter and an email who accuse me of being a pawn of the rich or, I have some position on the pandemic because I'm trying to save some material, financial interest of mine. It's like, or worse, I'm against the minimum wage because I think companies should be able to exploit workers. Really? You think that's why I'm against the minimum wage? I'm against the minimum wage because I think it hurts the least skilled among us. Now, I might be wrong about that, but I actually care passionately about that. And that you can't imagine that. I don't want to talk to you. Why do I want to have that conversation? So, it took me a while, but I block people on Twitter. I have a note now at the top of my profile, and I'm on Twitter at EconTalker, by the way. But I block people who assume the worst of me without knowing anything about me. Mm-hmm. I know why you like so-and-so or this position. It's like, actually, I don't even like that position. And now you're telling me the reason why. Like, so those people, you shouldn't talk to them. You wouldn't let them into your house to have dinner with you, to chat with them. It's not productive. So there is a minimum standard of civility and respect that I think is necessary for the kind of conversations we're talking about. And for those other ones, just stay away from them. They're not healthy for you. They just make your blood boil. Why would you do that? Not good for you.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that I want to definitely talk especially about social media and the effect of social media and the idea of like a virtual dinner table, right? We can talk about that. But before we get to that, one of the things, and we've got a question I can see already in the queue about polarization. That's something we're very interested in, obviously. And as we get closer to what is a very contentious election, I think, and we've got other things going on, like this whole pandemic thing, that are affecting our ability to kind of talk with one another about tough issues, which is always tough to do, but especially so now. I think there is a question about, have things gotten worse on those terms that we're less able to talk to one another? Is something special going on? And in particular, you've talked to, I'm just off the top of my head, you had Arnold Kling on recently about the reissue of his book, The Three Languages of Politics. You've talked to Liliana Mason who's at Maryland, I think, on Uncivil Agreement. And she's got a book that talks about our identities being consumed, really, or swallowed up by partisan politics. Sebastian Younger, you had on to talk about tribe. So I've heard you say, right, taking from each of these people, the importance of tribes, right? It's crazy to think that we're not part of tribes. That's an important part of who we are. But that at the same time, I think there is some worry about what our questioner is asking about, insanely polarized left and right, and how we're going to reconcile and mend relationships going forward. What have you learned about what we would probably call polarization, about our inability to talk to one another from those people, and what do you think's going on?
So it's a big question. It's a great question. And obviously we could spend another hour on that, but yeah. I'm 66 years old, which means I was born in 1954. I was a teenager in the 60s. I remember it very vividly. It was a time when we were very polarized. There was a lot of anger, a lot of yelling. There's a lot of violence. There were bombings and protests that ended in violence. It's both by the protesters and the police. So when I think about the current moment, I do try to remember that we've had moments like this before, that we did somehow come out of. That's important. That's my source of optimism, although I am very concerned right now. I'm very pessimistic. We are taping this 5 days or so before the election, and it is an alarming and very, very scary time. It is almost a cliche. I used to indulge in it myself to say that America's always been polarized to some degree, and politics has always been a blood sport. Go back to the election of 1800. That was nasty too. But I do think we're in a different time, and I want to give a couple reasons why. I think the reason that I've pointed to in a EconTalk episode on the outrage epidemic is what I call it, in an essay I wrote on it. It has to do with how the media's incentives have changed. The media, obviously, the former mainstream media, newspapers, TV, and so on, TV news, have been badly damaged by the internet, which is mostly a good thing. There's a lot more choice out there. The problem is that in that more competitive world, when it's not just three networks giving you mostly the same thing every night, meat and potatoes, now you get whatever you want. You can get your sushi over here, your Mexican food over here, your Chinese, you know, you get it's a massive buffet of information of anything you want. What that means, though, is that profitability, which depends on listenership, is very competitive in a way it wasn't before. Before, you could do a mediocre job, make a good living in the news world, either as the main newspaper in your town or the one of the three major networks. That's gone. And they find themselves in competition, not just with the people on the other side of the fence, but the people on their side of the fence. So if you're CNN, it's tempting to say, well, your competitor is Fox. Not really. Your competitor is MSNBC, and therefore you're going to have to be as loud and angry about Fox as they are, or you're going to lose a bunch of listeners who enjoy that buffet, that particular, they have their tastes are over there. And so I think that has literally destroyed the journalism business as we knew it last 15, 20 years ago, when there was at least a pretense of objectivity. There's no pretense of objectivity now. Totally different. And again, people say, yeah, that was the way it was in America in 1783. Yeah, totally different, though. It's the problem. Not really the best analogy. Everything is different now for lots of reasons. The reach of democracy. Anyway, so I think we're a lot angrier because anger sells. And the media has to, if they don't sell anger, they're not going to get any clicks. Most people like getting angry. Most people like feeling superior to their intellectual opponents. I think that's an unhealthy thing to succumb to, but it's a very human and common thing. Most people like feeling part of a tribe. It's very human. It's who we are. It's not inherently bad. There are many wonderful things about tribes, clans, families, and then there's some dark things about them. And what the media landscape has done now is exacerbated the dark things. It's put them on steroids. And so we haven't figured this out yet. No one has to figure it out, but it will emerge as a norm, I hope, and get better. But right now, we're not in a very good place. And what that means is, the analogy I use is that, you know, people can go around, think about how weird it would be if while you were asleep, people could put bumper stickers on your car, you know, that instead of saying, I brake for animals, which was a common bumper sticker of my youth, they would say, I accelerate to kill animals running in front of my car. Or I hate so-and-so's, a certain kind of person. Or it's like, whoa, and you go to peel that off, and sometimes you can't peel it off. Or worse, they put a big sign in front of your house. The person who lives here is a moron. The person who lives here is wicked. The person who lives here is evil. The person who lives here doesn't love his children. It's like, but that's what social media lets people do. And it lets them do it anonymously. Mm-hmm. So of course, there's a dark side of all of us that if we could say something nasty or mean about people we think are wrong, we might be tempted to do so. But to have a whole app, a whole website that lets me do that all day long, that kind of appeals to the worst side of us. So I think we're in a particularly challenging time for polarization. And I think, you know, the point I made about CNN and MSNBC, instead of moving to the middle where the bulk of the listeners are, the middle starts getting peeled off by people on the extremes. And so all of a sudden, the middle is not where you want to be. Yeah. Same thing's happening with our political candidates, right? If you've noticed over my lifetime, you know, there used to be Democrats you'd call conservative. There used to be Republicans you'd call liberal. That's dead. Why is that? Why is it that we have two candidates who I would not call centrist? They tend to represent. Now, Joe Biden is a more centrist candidate than Donald Trump on paper, but it's obviously the case that the Democratic Party and Biden's positions on many issues have moved away from the center, just like Trump's did, which is part of the reason he was able to be elected. So that, again, the old wisdom was in the primary season, you run for your base. You appeal to the most passionate part of your party. And then when the main election comes, you run to the middle because you want to reassure the independents and the more moderate members of your party that you're not going to do all those crazy things you said you do in the primary. Well, those days are over, more or less. I mean, there's a little bit of that going on in this election. I don't want to go into details, but there are much more extreme things on the table. And now the proponents of those, the people who love those candidates say things like, oh, he won't really do that when he's elected. And I'm thinking, well, he might. Why are you so sure?
Yeah.
And that again goes for both parties. So they both staked out much more extreme positions, about contesting this election, about our constitutional system. I mean, we're in an unbelievable time, terribly interesting, but terribly frightening, of uncharted tolerance for extreme ideas on both sides, I would say. Things that would have been unimaginable 10 years ago of a presidential candidate. When each side, again, I'm not going to go into the details, but each side's been asked questions in the debate where they don't just hedge the answer to make you think, oh yeah, they're not that passionate about it. They totally ignore the question, don't answer it at all.
Yeah.
Because they don't want to offend their base, that for them, that's their issue.
Yeah.
And that's just, that's a dark time, I think, for our country. You can't be honest.
Yeah.
The candidates are not honest about their actual, positions. And the base of each party, by base, not the right word, the more extreme members of each party have a lot more sway than they used to have. And so that's what I think we're seeing when we talk about polarization. The thing I would say to everybody out there listening, politics is not where life happens most of the time. Life happens around our tables and with our children and our parents and our loved ones and our relatives. And I know that everybody thinks that if that other person wins on November 3rd or November 30th, if it takes a while to figure it out, oh my gosh, it's going to be horrible. We're going to be a fill in the blank socialist country, a fascist dictatorship. It's probably not true. And you can have a good life with whoever's elected. Most of us. There may be people who are, badly affected by one candidate winning or the other, may have a tougher time. We should worry about that. It's important. But most of us live in a country, thank God, where we have lots of life outside of Washington, D.C.
Yeah. We just had Chris Fryman from William and Mary on, and he's just finished a book called Why It's Okay to Ignore Politics. And one of the points he makes is that if you were watching a movie or a television show that did to you what partisan politics seems to do in terms of being willing to dehumanize other people, or to, these polls that say, a not insignificant number of people are willing to entertain the possibility that if significant numbers of people who are in the out party from them died, the country would be better off, right? If you were watching or reading books that made you feel that way, you would have a moral obligation to turn them off or shut them. But in fact, what we're doing is like ratcheting up the volume.
Yeah. Give me more of that.
Yeah, and actually that's something we have to think about, is our own role in it. It's not happening to us necessarily. It's something that, at some level, I think there is a meeting of our demands and needs for that kind of thing, I want to make sure and get a question in here that was about the FCC fairness doctrine. Sharon asked, do you think reinstating FCC fairness doctrine would help?
Well, there's a whole bunch of things on the table right now to try to introduce more honesty into the conversation, which is a whole separate. There's sort of two levels here. There's literal lying, fake videos, fake footage, and that's of course a serious problem. Then there are things that some people think are, quote, outside the pale, and I don't like the government deciding what's outside the pale. I don't like Facebook deciding it either, but I'm really uncomfortable with the government deciding it. So, fairness is inherently a subjective word. If we think more generally about what the government can do to improve the quality of political information or policy information, I think generally want the government to stay out of it. I think what I want to see is fewer barriers to entry for competitors to Facebook, Twitter, and so on that might offer different alternatives. There's a lot of platforms trying to create the next social media alternative, and they struggle with the fact that you can't export your followers or your tweets or your posts to that new campaign because I've written thousands of posts on Twitter. They don't belong to me in any real sense. I don't have access to them. They belong to Twitter. So what I've done, and it's a good deal for me. I don't pay anything for it. I'm not complaining. But what they've done is And they're not very good at it. Twitter isn't very good at making money, but they've used our content to create an umbrella for them to make money off of ads, which is what Facebook's incredibly good at.
Mm-hmm.
And part of me says, God bless them. That's the name of the game. But we could think of some different ways to find the property rights in the content that I create on those sites, or to allow newcomers to access that in a way that we allow, say, with say phone numbers. Now, I'm not saying that's a good idea because I haven't thought it through, I haven't talked about it enough. But my first thought is that's a better way to get there from here than the government deciding, what Facebook can post, or they have to be liable for everything that shows up on their site, regardless of who posted it. That's going to be the end of social media. Having said all that and complained, I love Twitter. When I realized, you talked about how it makes, certain consumption or conversations make you feel. I had times on Twitter, in the last few years where I'd be in a bad mood. And I'd think about, why am I in such a bad, oh yeah, that person said that horrible thing about me, really ugly, grotesque accusation. And I realized I should block that person. Again, going back to what I said before, I wouldn't let that person come into my house and say, hi, I'm here for you. What do you want to say about me in front of my friends that I can't dispute anonymously, that you're going to say anonymously? So I think a lot of this, one step I think everyone should take who's on social media, if you want to contribute to a more civil discourse, is to block people who aren't civil. You don't know them anything. Block them. Stop playing with them. Stop engaging with them. Don't let them talk to you because they'll put you in a bad mood. They really will. And so I think that's a really relevant point about the role of the current. I mean, a lot of people I've talked to they're depressed, maybe even clinically, but they're not. Part of. I don't want to use that word too casually, but a lot of people I know are just like, they're down because of the nature of discourse, what people are saying about each other, the policy things that are on the table. This is such a unusual time, and find ways to get away from that. Read some Adam Smith. Go back to the 18th century. Get in touch with. Go read some Aristotle. Read some poetry. I'm reading a book. It's called One Long River of Song by Brian Doyle. You want to get yourself in a good mood? Read that book. Pick it up. There's not a political word in it. It's just about human beings and their experiences, and it's gloriously written.
Nice, I like that. I'm interested in that too. The question of how you go forward. So you've just given us one example. We have somebody in the chat, Julian, who's mentioning Braver Angels, which is a group we work with. They called us recently to ask us to promote a one-on-one conversation platform that they have, right? So they'll match you up red, blue, rural, urban, black, white, one-on-one online. And as we've talked to them, we've said, look, we've been promoting it, but we're not getting a lot of people who are willing to take those steps. I think part of it can be the fear of doing it, committing to conversations with strangers online about political differences. And they give you guidance and stuff too. So it's not like they're just throwing people out there.
The arena.
Yeah, exactly. That would be very different.
Here's your red cape. Go enjoy the bowl.
Yeah, that is what's on social media sometimes, right? But, I was listening to your conversation with Arnold about the 3 languages of politics. And one of the things the two of you discussed there was, the people who will read the book and think about those things might not be the people who need it, right? They might not be the people who are going to learn from it. And maybe a lot of people who are willing to take the steps to get on and have these one-on-one conversations already are, they want to learn, they want to engage with someone else, but maybe they're the people who most need it are not going to be willing to engage or be trying those things. So what to do about the fact that there's all these other people out there who may not want to take on the kind of responsibility of let's make things better?
Well, I'm a big fan of making the world better one step at a time, one person at a time, 1 hour at a time. I don't think we need to figure out the solution to polarization or this moment or social media. I think there's a huge mistake we make. Every one of us has something we can do here if you want to. Now, in a minute, you'll remind me, I want to talk about the people who don't want to. But for those of us who want to do something about it, who don't like this moment, it's really simple. Don't yell back. I can't tell you how many times people have yelled at me online or in emails or in person, and I don't yell back, and they go like, oh, they apologize often. So I kind of lost it. I was in a bad mood. I shouldn't have vented at you. I just felt, So it's very effective not to respond in kind. It's not as much fun sometimes because you do sometimes like getting into the shouting match, but try to I think step back is a really good idea. Those of us who care about civil discourse, kindness, all the cliches that are I think actually deep truths, we have an opportunity to make a small contribution in every interaction we have with people who don't agree with us. And that could be about over politics or where we're going to dinner tonight with your spouse or your buddy. It's, it's really every minute you have an opportunity to be a decent human being. I like the expression, everyone is in a battle, so be kind. Taking that to heart, which isn't easy because it's easy to forget and it's easy to want to indulge in a different motto. But when you can do that, you make the world a better place. I think that's really kind of straightforward. Now, I think we should confront the fact, and I think this is really, really challenging. A lot of the times we don't want to talk to people who disagree with us. We say to ourselves, "Oh, it's a waste of time. They're idiots." But sometimes it's, what if I found out I was wrong? What if I found out that the worldview, which I think is bolstered by all the facts are on my side after all, what if I find out there's facts that make me uncomfortable? And I think that's, again, takes a lot of courage. Vulnerability takes courage. I've been in a lot of arguments, especially when I was younger, where it was all just debating points. And I make a big contrast between debate and conversation. Debate's about winning, scoring, refuting. Conversations about learning, listening, explaining, exploring. Those are all better than those other kind of debate type things. And I think if we can have the courage to be vulnerable, to say like, it's okay to say like, I never thought of that. That's a really good point. I didn't know of that study. It's probably wrong, but I should at least look at it, So I think that it takes a certain level of courage to open yourself to a real conversation as opposed to a debate. I've been in so many debates where, people, you back them into a corner intellectually. They almost never say, you make some really good points. I'll have to think about it some more. I mean, when's the last time you were in an angry conversation like that? But in a conversation, as opposed to a debate, you could have a moment like that. And you could have a moment like that where you think it, but you don't admit it, which would still be good. That'd be a huge step forward.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. So we have a couple of questions here that I want to definitely get in. One from Travis, who says he's a listener of EconTalk and has been since 2009, which is awesome.
Thank you, Travis.
He says there are mass block lists on Twitter where groups post large lists of accounts to block based on profiles or opinions. Do you think this can lead to even further polarization between the spread of ideas?
I don't know anything about that.
No.
I do think there's a terrible, terrible problem in our conversations on Twitter and Facebook and elsewhere where you can never criticize your own side because that would be like, well, you're a traitor. How could you admit that so-and-so, your hero, your political standard bearer, that they made a mistake? So I just lay low about that. I'll just let other people say it. And then if you do say something nice or critical of someone that you're not supposed to, you have to then like put all these parentheses and asides. And, it's like, so-and-so did a really good thing that, not that I like him. I mean, he's horrible. Of course, I think he's evil. And so I think that's a real, we see that in the pandemic, recording this, you said, in the middle of the pandemic. And as a result, you can't, what kind of world do we live in where if you say something about masks, you've made a political statement? That's a weird thing, right? That's not healthy for trying to figure out whether we should wear masks or not. So masks have become a form of tribal identity, either wearing one or not wearing one. Both sides have it. And that makes it hard to figure out how to reduce this pandemic. That's bad.
Yeah.
So not good.
No, not at all. Okay, one last question before we get to some housekeeping business here. And this is from Chalin, who has said that I'm asking all the softball feel-good questions to you, but he wants to get to the real tough elephant in the room question that they all came here for, according to him.
Oh, great. I better, I can't hear you. What? Give me the hard button.
He wants to know when EconTalk is getting new music in the intro.
That's a brutal question. Thank you, Chalin. Don't let him dodge the question, Chalin writes. It's an interesting thing. I chose that music, that intro music for EconTalk, because someone had used it as the soundtrack for a beautiful visualization of how airplane flights across America mirror population and travel patterns. So not surprisingly, the market responds to that by creating more flights for more common trips and fewer flights for the less attractive trips. Something like that. I'm giving you the rough idea of it. And this person put the music behind that. And I thought, well, that's kind of one of the most important themes of EconTalk, emergent order, the idea that things aren't planned by any one czar or airplane czar. So I just kind of like that. I put it up. So now if I do occasionally run a poll of what we should do with the music. There are people who want to get rid of it. They're sick of it. I do remind you that it's only for a few seconds, but there are people who defend it, who feel like it's kind of, there's a Pavlovian love for it too.
Because they know it's coming.
Yeah, here comes the food. It's like the can opener for my cat. It's the way I like to think of it. Yeah. I don't have a cat anymore, but we used to have an electric can opener for our cat. You play the can opener and the cat shows up. They're kind of a pitiful thing, and I don't mean to suggest that EconTalk is brain food, but I like to think it is.
I do. I think that's right. Well, we are going to be running out of time here, and we want to respect people's time again. But I just want to say thank you, Russ, for being here. I know I totally enjoyed the conversation, and
Me too. It's great.
Suspect that the folks who are listening did as well. If you are not already following Russ on Twitter, at EconTalker, you can also find out more at his website, russroberts.info, and you can get your EconTalk swag, right? We want to give a big thank you to our co-sponsor, the Library of Economics and Liberty. You can find their work, including EconTalk, at econlive.org. We'll put the link in our follow-up email tomorrow. It's an online resource for economics for every part of life. They've got a daily blog, EconLog, EconTalk, of course, the concise encyclopedia of economics, and a whole bunch of different things that can be used in the classroom, but also for self-directed learning. So as I said, we'll put the link there as well. If you enjoyed today's conversation and you want to hear more, we want to encourage you to subscribe to our podcast, Civil Squared, wherever you get your podcasts. I mentioned our episode this week, just in time for the election, Why It's Okay to Ignore Politics, with Dr. Chris Fryman of William and Mary University, and our conversations with Tanya Israel, Pamela Paresky. We get to talk to really interesting people every other week, and we'd love to have you join us. So just final words of thanks. Thank you for taking your time out of your day, which I'm sure is busy, for all of you to join us. I hope it was a worthwhile investment on your part. And thank you especially to those of you in the audience who are donors to Civil Squared. We are a public charity, and it's only because of the generosity of our supporters that this kind of programming is possible. So if you're not already a donor and you found this conversation worthwhile, I hope you'll join our community of supporters. You can find a donate button in your follow-up email, and I hope you use it. Russ, thank you so much for being with us. It was awesome, and thanks for everything you do with EconTalk. I think you said you wanted to learn stuff from your conversations. I know that when I listen to it, I learn stuff all the time, and I really appreciate it.
Thanks so much. Thanks for having me. It was a great conversation.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.